2 years ago, I came up with the idea of doing a three-dimensional inlay project to make a simulated fossil and put it in the top of a table. And it just so happened that my wife was taking my son out of town for a weekend, so I had about 2.5 days to just do nothing else other than woodwork and learn how to make a project video and put it on YouTube. So I literally pre-made my meals, took care of every other thing that would take my time, and woodworked 16 hours a day for nearly 3 days. And this was the result. Now, I made a video for this fossil table, and it was one video really fast, no talking, no voiceover, no explanation. But I was looking over the footage, and there was enough there to give a better explanation of some of the challenges and things that I thought about. So I thought I'd go back through it now that my audience has grown and it's been a little while. So that's what I'm going to do in this video and the following video. Now, I didn't have any video of how I actually put these three pieces of curly maple together to make the table, but I did want to talk about the design. Because this form wasn't my first attempt when I did the fossil table. I built a couple end tables similar, but I wanted to point out an important difference. This one used to have banding around the edge right here, but as you can see, with the boards just glued up this way, I had a grain expansion issue right here and the banding cracked off. So with the long grain running around the circumference of the new table with the pieces joined up in these three triangles, you could still imagine maybe I'd have some grain issues, but it hasn't been enough to crack this banding off after a couple years. Minnesota summers, Denver winters, this has experienced both. So I'm comfortable saying that it's solid enough and the grain orientation is not going to be a problem. So let's take a look at how I built this top.
So the first step is set up my tracing paper. I make 2 marks on the tabletop and then copy it on the tracing paper so that I can always get it back in position. And then I kind of roughly define the area that I want the fossil to be contained in. Now I just lay the tracing paper over my laptop and start tracing out the bones of a fossil. This worked really well for the tracing paper just because the monitor actually glows and it shows through better and it's easier to see, and I didn't have to mess around with printing out something larger than a standard piece of paper, which this would have been. So building up my pattern this way allowed me to take some artistic liberty with the fossil and do some things that made it fit the table better, made the fossil a little bit more triangular to look like it fit, and kind of posed the skeleton in a way that made it a little bit more obvious what it was, since I couldn't do details quite as fine as the actual thing. So I changed the position of the wings and opened the mouth a little bit and generally fitted the shape to a triangular table just a little bit. Now each of these bones that I'm drawing is actually going to be carved in 3 dimensions, at least on the top. So after I finish up tracing everything out, I shade the areas of the bones that are going to be sloped a little bit more on top to give them a 3D profile. Before using carbon paper to test out tracing the bones onto the workpiece, and this worked really well. The dark carbon paper shows up really good on the maple. So I flatten one side of a block of ebony before using the bandsaw to give myself some thin slices, a little less than 1/8 of an inch thick, that I'll cut each of the bones out of. And I clean those up with some mineral spirits. So to cut the bones out of the ebony, after tracing them onto the maple, I use white carbon paper to trace the outline of the bones onto each piece of ebony. And then take it to the scroll saw to cut each piece out. So now I put double stick tape on the back of the bone slash piece of ebony, however you want to think of it at this point. So I stick that to the table where it belongs and trace around the edges with an X-Acto knife. So now I have an outline of the bone, not just with carbon paper, but a very precise detail of where the edges are from that knife. And that'll help me when I'm using the router later on to excavate the hole for the bone slash piece of wood. So I clean it up and use a pencil to trace out and make the edge a little bit more visible. And now it's time to route it out. And I started out with this router bit, but had to go down to something a lot smaller. I think I ended up using this 1/16 of an inch bit to do the majority of the work. And when the little pieces of wood start breaking off from the edge, you know that you're close enough to the X-Acto knife cut. So now for glue, to glue in the pieces of ebony, I mix some black dye in with normal wood glue, just so if I have any squeeze out, it won't be visible against the ebony. Now I stick the piece of wood slash bone to a piece of double stick tape again and use this little end mill to carve a profile on it and give it texture and three-dimensional character and make it look even more like just a fossilized mineral deposit that took the place of an actual animal bone. I put glue on the back. And now it's ready to go in place. And this is actually a really forgiving inlay project because if you have any little gaps, since I'm going to be carving around these pieces, you can kind of compensate for any mistakes you make. So it's actually a pretty good project to get your feet wet both in carving and inlay. So there it is, one piece done, many more to go. But I had lots of time on my hands this particular weekend, so I just took it one step at a time, one bone at a time, and eventually finished them all. And then it was time to carve. So the goal is to make it look like all of these bones were embedded in a piece of material in the wood, and then someone came along and discovered them and carefully chiseled away all of the material surrounding the bone, just like would happen with a normal fossil. So with that in mind, I just kind of set to work removing all of the material adjacent to the bones, and I ended up turning the whole carved area into a triangle that seemed to look the best visually. And the trickiest thing about the way that I did this was that I had to remove all of the material that was in the same plane with the edges, because if any of it was sticking up, if I missed one little spot, then it'd be poking up through the epoxy that I ended up pouring all over this, and it looked really silly. It'd stick out and really draw the eye. So I had to make sure I carved everything. And that was really tricky. What I should have done is, before putting the bones in, just used a router to take off maybe a 32nd of an inch everywhere that I was going to carve, and that way if I missed just a little bit, it would be a 32nd inch below the edges and it wouldn't matter. So that would have been a lot smarter and would have saved me a lot of time and worry, because I was really worried I'd pour the epoxy on and then find that I missed one little spot and it's poking up through. So now it's epoxy time. I use this Envirotex Light pour-on epoxy. It's cheaper than using like the glue type epoxy, and I think it's made to have a little bit more flex, because obviously there's some flex in this piece of wood, and it certainly hasn't been a problem. As I mentioned, the table's seen quite a bit of expansion, or at least different humidities, and I haven't seen any separation between the epoxy and the wood, so I can give this a pretty strong recommendation. It worked good for me. Now notice the shim on the back of the table. I took a lot of care to make sure that the table was perfectly level with the earth, so that I didn't have all the epoxy flowing to one end. That would have made a real mess. This was a nerve-wracking process, a lot of work in the table at this point, and if I screwed up this epoxy, it would be really hard to fix it. And you end up with little bubbles on the top of the epoxy, and a torch will take care of those. I'm told that it's the carbon dioxide in the torch that's actually doing the work and not the heat. Haven't verified that. That's just kind of popular rumor. Either way, it works. And this is where I am at this point. Now for the edge banding. Now I just wrapped up 3 pieces of wood in a towel and clipped a piece of garden hose, put it in a tea kettle, and stuck it in the towel for the most rudimentary steam box that anyone's ever come up with. And this works great unless you manage to let the water all evaporate and boil out of the teapot, and then you melt it and destroy your wife's teapot and smelt the house, which is what I did the second time that I tried to use this technique. So use at your own risk. But it worked this time. The pieces of wood come out all steamy. I put them on this little bending form and gave them slightly more bend than they'll have on the edges of the table. So they hold their bend pretty well, not too much spring back. I just put a little bit of glue on there. And then contrive a way to clamp them up and get equal pressure. It's kind of hard with a triangular table. All the force has to go into that one opposite point. So I left the corner banding off until I had all the sides on. So that's what it looks like. I used some hand planes just to flush it up with the sides. This is kind of a strange use for a scrub plane, but it worked. Now I trim the excess off the sides. It doesn't matter the angle that I end up with here as long as the cut is relatively straight, or quite straight actually. Because for each of these corners I just lay out a piece of wood and draw in the exact sides that I need. I rough cut this on the bandsaw. and then fine tune it on the disc sander. And I put some sawdust in this glue that I'm using so that it will match the wood if I have any gaps, which of course I never do, so I don't know why I bother. I just clamp and glue those in place. And then since that's too small for a hand plane, I just use a saw to cut out the excess. And then I sand it all flat. I can't remember the exact grit progression that I used. I think I started with something around 200 and maybe went to 300. If I get it wet, you can start to see what it's going to look like with the epoxy polished back up. For the final treatment, I really polished the heck out of this, but for now, about 300 grit is good. So that's the top.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that and found it interesting. In the next video, I'll show how I made these legs and the middle base and put the whole thing together. Bye, everyone.